We're going to talk about optimizing SQL Server 2012 with SharePoint 2013. Does everybody have that configuration in their room? Oh, so the rest of you have to leave. No, just kidding. Now the good news is I put those numbers up there just to get you in here. I had this posted with Steve at Optimizing SQL Server 2005 with SharePoint 2007, and he declined the session. He's like, why, dude? He's like, well, no one's going to be running that. But the good news is no matter what flavor of SQL you're running and what flavor of SharePoint you're running, everything we're going to talk about is applicable. So I put the versions up there just to get you in the room. Okay, so if you're sitting there, it's like, oh, I'm actually really running SharePoint 2010, and I'm running SQL 2008 or SQL 2014, this is all going to be good for you. It's all going to work. It's all going to do the same thing for you. So just to get that out. So my name is Brian Alderman. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's on the west side of the United States. Anybody ever been there? No? Oh, cool. Couple of you. Good. Nice area. So I work for a company called CBT Nuggets. We do on-demand video training. I just finished a 70-346, which is the first exam for the Office 365, and the 70-347 was the second exam for Office 365. And we have the 331, 332 out there. So if you're trying to get your MCSE for SharePoint, those are the 4 courses you're going to go through, take the exams, and then you'll have your MCSE for SharePoint. So I do that, and I speak at a lot of conferences. I'm actually here this week, and in 2 weeks I'll be speaking at Chicago at the Ignite conference. So, and I do a lot of SharePoint Saturdays, and last year I did 21 conferences and about 40 sessions. My company asked me to cut back and do some real work this year. So my email address is brian.alderman@cbtnuggets.com. If you want to reach me afterwards, if you have any questions about anything that we're doing, you can certainly reach me there. My Twitter handle is Brian Alderman, all one word. I don't tweet what I'm eating and when I'm going to the bathroom. It's pretty much what's going on with my work event and when I'm speaking and what sessions I'm doing and all that cool stuff. So you're welcome to follow me on that. And the company is cbtnuggets.com, or CBT Nuggets as well. My own company, where I do the authoring of books, as you see it's coming up, I got a couple books I've written for Microsoft Press. That is actually through my company called microtechpoint.com. And out there I do some blogging, not as much as I wish I could do, but there are a couple situations in this session where I'm going to say, check out my blog. It'll give you the details on how to do certain things. So that's where you can go find my blog. It's microtechpoint.com, and you'll get Brian's blog. And plus you'll see my speaking schedule. I try to keep that up to date as well. And then I've authored 2 SharePoint books. I did a couple SQL books as well. I co-authored the SharePoint 2010 Administrator Companion for Press, and then co-authored the SharePoint 2013 Administration Inside Out. So you can access those. Normally, if I wasn't flying across country and out here, I actually went to Ireland for 3 days. I'm going to Paris on the tail end of this. So I just didn't have enough room in my suitcase. Normally, I give away a book in my sessions, but I didn't make that happen this time because I didn't have enough room in the suitcase. Love to travel. That's the advantage of doing what I do, is I get to travel and help people out with sharing my knowledge with them. And I love to play golf. I suck at it, but I love to play. That's why I moved to Arizona, is to play golf. And I started traveling. So this is the map of the United States. I grew up in a state called Vermont. That little guy up there, that is a state, by itself. Because I have to say that I was in California once. I got in a cab, and the driver asked me where I was from. I said Vermont. And he says, "Go. What state is that in?" So when I'm on the west side of the coast, on the west side of the states, I always tell that Vermont is a state. It's not the smallest state. Anybody know the smallest state in the United States? Rhode Island. Who said that? Nicely done. Good for you. You get a free ice cream as soon as you come out to the door to the left. Okay. On me. Yeah, we're the 8th smallest state. And then I moved to Colorado Springs, and eventually I moved down to Arizona, where it gets hot sometimes, a lot. So when I was in Vermont, this is Mom, Dad, and me. I grew up in a town called Mulletville. It's actually called Milton. But notice the hair that I had back then. And how many people are new to SharePoint? Fairly new to SharePoint in the last year or two. If you're fairly new to SharePoint, take a picture of yourself and how much hair you have now. Because you can see, this was me when I was younger, and then I met SharePoint, and you see what's happened. It's going to happen, okay? So you got to be careful with that. Take a picture and say pre-SharePoint, post-SharePoint after 4 or 5 years, and you'll see a significant difference. Or if you're a lady, it's just going to get grayer, so just quit counting the grays at that point. Then I moved to Arizona because the golf game got much easier for me. You can pretty much chip in anywhere. And so if you're ever thinking about trying to move to improve your golf game, come on out to Arizona. I love the fact this guy's not taking any chances. He's lining up his putt. So apparently he's been on the 19th hole as well, because if he's going to line up his putt that far, and when it's that big, you're going to have problems. But so we're going to talk about SharePoint SQL Server. How many people are DBAs in here? All right, about a third, about a fourth of you. Okay, so if you're a DBA, probably about the first 10 minutes, if you're looking for a power nap because you're hungover, go ahead and take it in the first 10 minutes. Okay, because it's going to be more of an introduction to SQL Server. For those of us who are in SharePoint, it's like, oh man, I didn't realize SQL Server was so involved with SharePoint. And that's one of the reasons I got involved with SharePoint, was because it sat on top of SQL Server. Now, if you haven't heard about Windows 10, everything's been fixed in Windows 10. That's the plane I took out here. So we have no problems with Windows 10, so get ready for that upgrade. I just found that the other day, and I had to get it in my presentation somehow. So yeah, so that's a U.S. Airways flight out of Philadelphia, I think. But anyway, so let's talk about what we're going to do. We're going to talk about a few things here. We're going to provide an introduction to SQL Server. Then we're going to look at why we're concerned about SQL Server with SharePoint. And we're going to demo SQL Server and database optimization, what I need you to do. So my goal today is to convince you to go back to your DBA and get your own instance of SQL Server just for SharePoint, and then ask them to make some changes to that instance of SQL Server that will optimize SharePoint for you. And then how many people have run into ginormous transaction log files where you've run out of disk space and the SharePoint stops working? We're going to look at fixing that too. And no, if you search online, it says to put it in simple recovery model. That's not how we want to fix it in production. We're going to walk through why we not want to do that. Then we'll wrap up with some best practices. And if I don't talk too long, we'll do some Q&A. I thought this was a 75-minute session, and I found out it's 60. So I'm going to have to talk a little bit faster, and I've never been accused of ever talking too slow. So let's begin with an introduction. First off, SQL Server. So you're going to have lunch. My recommendation is take your DBA to lunch once a month. All right, get to know that person, or if it's a group of them, take one at a time. Don't take them all. If you happen to be the SQL Server DBA and the SharePoint admin, get the business company credit card and take yourself to lunch. And just sit on each side of the table and talk to yourself like you're having a conversation. Waitresses love that. Oh, don't order any more tequila after you do that, but. Yeah, because what you want to do is you want to get to know these people, because you want them on your side. And DBAs, I mean, I used to be a DBA before I got into SharePoint, and we're not easy to work with. I get that. I don't know how I even have a fiance, but I got lucky enough to have a fiance. But we're very control freaks. We're very much a control freak as a DBA. And SharePoint admins aren't as bad as the DBAs, but because we're, ultimately it's our responsibility to make sure everything shines and make sure everything works. If something breaks, it's going to be our fault, no matter if someone else did it or not. So if you get to know your DBAs, you can find out what they're doing with, like, for instance, maybe in July 4th weekend, you're thinking about upgrading to SharePoint 2013. Well, July 4th weekend, they're thinking about upgrading from SQL Server 2012 to 2014. You probably don't want those two upgrades going on at the same time. So you get to know them, take them out to lunch once a month, and then as we go through this session, there's going to be other things that you can talk to them as you go through and have lunches with them, or take them to happy hour. Tequila usually works faster than a couple lunches, so if you can get some tequila in them, that will work as well. So when we're talking about SQL Server, if you walk up to your DBA and say, dude, I'm going to install SharePoint, I need an instance of SQL Server. Well, they may say, we already have an instance out there. Just go ahead and use that one. That's where you got to say, no, actually, I don't really want to use that one. What I really need to do is I need my own instance, because there's going to be certain things I need, and I'm going to tell you what those are for that instance of SQL Server. But they can install multiple instances of SQL Server on the same box. So it's not like they have to spin up a brand new box. We can install 50 versions of SQL Server on the same box. I'm not saying you should, but you could do that. The first one you install is called the default instance, and the second one, every instance after that is called a named instance, and you just give it a name. So what they're going to do is they're going to run setup, they're going to install SQL Server for you, and they're going to give it a name called SharePoint. So just type in SharePoint, that way you know when you're working with it that you have an instance called SharePoint. The next thing I would like for them to do, I don't have it on this slide, but it's coming up, is I want them to create an alias. So once you convince them to install SQL Server just for you for SharePoint, then ask them to create an alias for that. That's an alias that they'll create in the SQL world. So if they decide to move it from server 1 to server 4 down the road, it's not going to bother you. They're going to just change that alias in SQL Server from pointing to server 1 to server 4. And everything that you've done in SharePoint is pointing to that alias. So as long as they direct it to the right server, you don't have to worry about going back through and everywhere you put server 1, now you need to change it to server 4. So when you convince them to get your own instance of SQL Server for SharePoint, also convince them to create a SQL Server alias and tell you what that is. So as you spin up SharePoint, you can walk through there and you'll specify the alias. And that way, if they want to mess around with the machinery behind the scenes, it's not going to affect what you've done. I thought I had that. It's probably on the next slide, actually. Each of these instances are managed individually. That's why I wanted to get our own, because they're going to be making changes that we're going to request, and it's not going to affect the line of business apps that they already have out there. We're going to look at some of those when we go into to a demo. But they do share resources. So if I have 2 instances of SQL Server on a 32 gigabyte RAM box and a terabyte of disk space, we're going to be sharing those system resources. So we don't want to have too many instances of SQL Server running on the same box. The other thing we have to worry about is the type of databases. Every instance, including the one you're going to have for SharePoint, has its own set of system databases. We don't mess around with them too much. We're going to talk about those in more detail. And then every time we create a database, so if I go and create a web app or some service apps inside of Central Admin, every time I do so, we get an MDF file, a master data file, and we get an LDF, which is a transaction log file. And every time I add in any content to a list or a library in SharePoint, it's written to the LDF file. And a little bit later on, we're going to walk through the process shortly. It's written to the MDF file. So you'll always have an MDF and an LDF for every database, whether it's be for a web app or a service app. And then optionally, we can have an NDF. We're not going to be too concerned about that. But just remember, an NDF is a way for extending a database. And we look at the TempDB database, which I'll introduce shortly. That's how we're going to do that. We're going to add another file associated with the TempDB database, and that's going to be an NDF file. And I'll get more detail when I get up to that piece here. So this is the reason that we're concerned with SharePoint and SQL Server. So let's say we're going into a list and we want to pull up some content from in our list. The first thing it's going to do is go out to SQL Server and say, hey, SQL Server guy, do you have any data that's already, I want to go into this list that's in our portal, our HR portal, and I want to see if there's any content in there. So it's going to go out, it's going to see if that content that we're trying to work with is in what's called buffer cache. So it's a component of SharePoint, of SQL Server, excuse me. If it's not in there, it's going to go out to SQL Server and read those pages in that we're working. So every list and library we have in SharePoint is stored in a table inside of SQL Server. So we're going to check to see if that information's in the buffer cache. If it's not, it's going to load it into the buffer cache. And then what it's going to do, if I do an insert or an update or a delete, it's first going to write that to the LDF file. That's that ginormous transaction log that we keep getting. And then a little bit later on, there's a process called the checkpoint process, roughly 60 seconds. We'll go with that for now. It reads that every 60 seconds, that LDF file, and says, oh, what's new since the last 60 seconds? And it writes that to the MDF file. And that's all part of the data recovery process built into the relational database. Oracle has something very similar. They use different names, but it's a very similar process. So that's all data recovery. And one of the reasons we want our own databases, our own instance of SQL Server, is because we're going to need some tweaks to that SQL Server instance that will help SharePoint become more, will optimize SharePoint. So that's the process of why the transaction log is involved and what it does for us. And that's the reason that we get huge transaction logs, LDF files. And we're going to look at how we address those in a little bit. Now, when there's 3 settings on the types of databases that we have. We have a simple recovery model, we have full recovery model, and for this presentation we have a bulk log, but we're not going to talk about that. Primarily when you're in a production environment, everything should be in a full recovery model, but some people will put some databases, like some of your TempDB database, for instance, is in a simple recovery model. And what that means is, when I come in here and I go through this process that we went through in a previous slide, on step 1, it's going to go in, check is there any data in the buffer cache. If not, it's going to load it into buffer cache. That's all the same, regardless of what version, whether we're in simple or full, I should say. And then it's going to write the transaction to the LDF file. Now, the big difference between simple recovery model and full recovery model is right here. When that checkpoint process writes the content from the LDF to the MDF, if it's in simple recovery model, it flushes that content out. So if you go out and you do a search right now as why do I have huge transaction logs in SharePoint, some people may say to put the database into simple recovery model. Please don't do that. And I'll convince you by the end of the session why, but don't do that. That's not the solution. Because what you're doing, if you do so, is you're emptying your LDF file out. If you empty your LDF file out, you have no way to do a full recovery in the event you lose data during the day. And I'll walk you through that in this session as well, okay? Now, so the problem is this checkpoint process, it goes in, it writes the content from the LDF to the MDF, it spends 60 seconds, it does it again and again and again and again, and it continues to flush that out. So our transaction log will never grow because there's nothing in there. Every time it's written, it's flushed. Now, if I go to a full recovery model, it's just the opposite. Everything else is the same up to here, but when that checkpoint process runs, it retains those transactions. I know that sounds like a bad thing because of the ginormous transaction logs, and that's what causes it. It's because those things never get flushed. And we'll talk about some of the reasons that that doesn't happen. So those are the two recovery models that you're going to work with in the SharePoint world, simple recovery and full recovery. If you're in a production environment, you want to stay in full recovery model, and I'm going to show you why we want to do that from a recovery process, and why we can, and how we'll use, how we'll avoid those ginormous transaction logs. So every instance of SQL Server has 4 system databases. It has the master database, which is very similar to our config database in SharePoint. It holds all the configuration information for that instance of SQL Server. It has the MSDB database, and that's where all the jobs and operators and alerts and replication and log shipping, all that information is stored in SQL Server in the MSDB database. As SharePoint admins, we're not too concerned with either of those. As long as the DBA is doing their job, we're good. Now, where we come in to the SharePoint world is the TempDB database. Every time we decide to go out to a list that has 5,000 items, and we want to see that alphabetized, or we want to see it chronological order, it needs somewhere to store that content, to shuffle and slice and dice it to represent it to us. So what it does, it stores it in this TempDB database. Now, the TempDB database is one database that would, by default, is one of several databases that's on the C drive, and it has one LDF file and one MDF file. And if we're doing a lot of data analysis, or we're generating a lot of reports inside of SharePoint, we may want to have multiple TempDB databases. Sorry, let's say that differently. Multiple files for that TempDB database. So I talked about that NDF file. We can actually put an NDF file in separate spindles, so that way we're actually getting better performance when we're doing our slicing and dicing of content. So that's one. The second one that affects SharePoint is the model database. The model database is used every time we create a new database. Whatever's in the model database, it takes a Polaroid picture of it, and it brings it into my new content database for either the web app or the service app or whatever app we're working with. So that's very important. And out of the box, when SQL Server is installed, they're not configured to be optimized for, not even for SQL Server, let alone for SharePoint. So these are the things that we can talk to our SQL Server database about. So that's again, for those of you that dozed off, wake back up, because that was a little bit on SQL Server. Now we're talking about SQL Server and SharePoint. So those two integrated are, as you can see here. I already mentioned to you that the idea of getting you in here was to put the versions up there. SQL Server 2012, it's also SQL Server 2014, SQL Server 2008, 2005, 2007 for SharePoint, 13, all that good stuff. This is all applicable. There's 87% of all of the data that you put inside of SharePoint is stored in SQL Server. But do remember, 78.9% of all statistics are made up on the spot. Okay? So don't hold me on that 87%. Farm configuration information, that's stored in a configuration database in SQL Server. That's similar to our master database that we have in SQL. The central admin content database is stored in SQL Server. How many people have installed SharePoint and gone into the SQL Server afterwards and found the central admin content database with the GUID the size of Texas? All right, it's a pain in the butt to work with. So if you go to my blog, there's an article out there on how to gently rename that, so you don't have to worry about uninstalling SharePoint and reinstalling. So that's one article out there. Every web app, if you just blow through a web app and you do install, I think it's WSS_config by default. If you want to rename those, I also have it's a separate article with separate steps, a blog article on how to rename how to rename content databases, web app content databases, okay? Now, for those of you with service apps, if you installed SharePoint 2013, Search has 4 databases, all with a GUID. Is it GUID or GUID over here? How many people use GUID? Oh, I like this country. How many people use GUID? Okay, where are you guys from? I'm just kidding. Over the U.S., the East Coast uses GUID, and the West Coast seems to use GUID. I don't know what it is, but I always test. So this is a good place. GUID I like GUID. Somebody said, well, you don't say squid when you talk about squid, but squid's a word. It's not an acronym. Okay, anyway, so we're off that. That's good. So check out my blog on how to rename and get rid of those GUIDs off from the your central admin content database and your web app content databases. And most every service application has at least one database. Like I said, search has 4, user profile service has 3. So we have to be careful about what we do with these databases. And for service apps, if you want to rename those are all very, very picky. So there's actually a blog of a TechNet article on how to rename those depending on the service app. So if you want to get rid of those GUIDs on that. The best way to do that is actually, instead of using the interface to install SharePoint, is to use PowerShell. That way you can name every database whatever you want. If you need to rebuild a server or you need to rebuild your farm, you can do so because you got everything written in PowerShell. Everybody know how to use PowerShell? They're all PowerShell masters? Everybody said, yes, I'm going to come talk to you afterwards. You can help me. Okay. So SharePoint, if you run, anybody know what a spousal spousal installation is? How many people have done a spousal installation? You know what it is? Okay. So spousal installation, when you sit there and you hit the setup, you get it going, and you sit there and you go, okay. So there's no, it's just like when you're talking to your spouse. Yes, undo, okay. So I call that a spousal installation. So if you do a spousal installation, you could end up with about 20 some odd databases, all with those GUIDs in there. So again, check out my blog article on how to rename those, the central admin content database and the web content databases associated with the, if you install the portal, if you run through the farm configuration wizard. Anybody run the farm configuration wizard that's right in the tail end to install your service apps? Good. At least no one's admitting to it, which is a good thing. Because I don't even know why that's here. I run it once just to say I run it and put it in my resume, and then it didn't really help at all. So don't run that, baby. It's not a good. I mean, you can use it if you want to, if you're desperate to install something real quickly, if you're in a test environment. But generally speaking, we want to stay away from that. Content databases can contain several site collections, but a site collection can only reside in one content database. Microsoft has a soft recommendation, which means it's not, if you call them up and say, I would need some help, I've got content databases that are, 500 gigabytes. So they have soft limits and they have hard limits. So a soft limit is like, you should keep your databases around 200 gigs. And they have hard limits, like you can't have more than 10 million items or 50,000 site collections, whatever the numbers are. So if you call up on one of those that's a hard limit, they're going to put you on mute. They're going to laugh and tell all their friends around them, this guy just did this. And then they'll come back, yeah, sorry, we can't help you. But this 200 gigabyte thing is just a soft limit. It's really just for, to minimize the amount of time for backups and minimize the downtime if you have to do a recovery. So it's roughly, you can keep with a 200 gigabyte database, you got to be able to keep it under 4 hours for a recovery. So we're going to look at, if we're trying to stay within those limits provided by Microsoft as a recommendation, we can control those from inside of SharePoint. Now, or we can talk to our DBA over lunch or tequila shots. And what we'll do is inside of SharePoint is we're going to create site collection quota templates, and we're going to apply those to the web application. So every time, by default, every time we create a site collection, it's going to be, we'll say 500 megabytes, all right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to go in and we're going to put a maximum number of site collections per database. If we take those two steps inside of SharePoint, we can control the size of our databases. If we want to stay 200 gigs or 300 or 100, we can control that just using those two steps inside of SharePoint, whatever that product is. So let's walk through this little example together. I want us to be able to control the size of our database. So we have a web app that's out there, and we have by default when we create that web app, we get one database. But we've gone through, what we want to do is we want to look at meeting the soft requirement, the recommendation by Microsoft of keeping that around 200 gigabytes. So what we could do is we want to control the number of site collections going into those databases. We're going to put a maximum number of site collections. And by the way, and this is kind of a side note, if you want, you can have a site collection. I've done this for companies where they have a site collection per database. And there's ones for projects, ones for HR, ones for marketing. So you can be very specific. You can use a PowerShell command, or you can go inside the interface and force a site collection into a database if you have multiple databases. So let's just say we just came out of our 37th meeting, and we've decided that we're going to need 800 site collections, and each site collection is going to be 500 megabytes in quota. And we've created a web app already. We only have a single database. These other three are there for show for now. And we decided that, okay, if I'm going to use 800 site collections at 500 megabytes of quota, and I only want them to be a maximum of 200 gigabytes, how many databases would I need to hold those 800 site collections at 500 megabytes each and keep my databases under 200 gigs? Real quick math, if you look at it, it's actually, it would come out to 2. If you just did 800 divided by 2, we'll get you down to 200 gigabytes. So really, if you do the quick math, it's going to be 2. But how many people have created a web app in Central Admin? About a fifth of you. So there's a setting inside of there. If you go back into settings for a web app, and that setting is really with that base, the default setting really says that 500 megabyte is not a true number for each site collection. Does anybody know what that setting is? What increases that from 500 megabytes? Who said that? Second stage recycle bin, definitely free ice cream for you. We'll see what else they're giving away. You can actually get a free fake tattoo if you want one of those out there too. I'm giving away everything they are out there. So it's actually the second stage recycle bin by default is 50%. So when we say we're going to have 800 site collections at 500 megabytes, that's not true. It's 807 site collections at 750 megabytes. And so we didn't have to do the math because I know probably half of us are hungover. Not me, but half of you are hungover. If we have a 750 megabytes and we have 250 site collection, that's going to come out to about 183 gigabytes. So if that's the case, we're going to create 8. So that means every database can only have 250 site collections. So if that's the case, each database now will only have 250. So my first database will have 250. That'll be 500. That'll be 750. That's short of the 800. So I'd have to create 4 databases that's going to hold and put a maximum number of site collections at 250 with a site collection quota template of 500. And then inside of SharePoint, we're controlling the size of our databases. And we have some wiggle room. Now, if we do this math up front, the good thing about what SharePoint will do, so let's say we went through our meeting, we hadn't really spun anything up, we had 0 site collections, and now we rolled out these 4 databases before we started adding site collections. SharePoint will do a round-robin approach when it starts adding site collections. It'll look at all 4 databases and say, okay, you can have a max of 250, you 250, you 250, you 250. You all have 0. So I'm going to put the first site collection in database number 1. Site collection number 2 comes in. You have room for 249 because you already have one, 250, 250, 250. So I'll put it in the second one. Third one, fourth one, and it'll go back around. So it's always going to put it in the site collection, in the database that has the least number of site collections based on the maximum number of site collections. So if this is 250 and that's 250 and that's 250 and they each have 10 in it, and that's 500 and that has 10 in it, the next 250 are going to go into that one because if you do the math, like out of possible 500, you've got 10 in there. That means you have room for 490 more. Where the other 3, out of 250, if I do the math, subtract 10, you only have room for 240 more. So that 4th database, which is at a maximum site collections of 500, will get the next several site collections until it catches up. So when they do the math, oh, now you have room for 240, you have room for 240, you have room for 240, and now this guy will have room for 240 because we've added another 250 site collections to it. And you can do, and it's varies. It's two commands, PowerShell commands, just to force a site collection into a database if you want to go into a specific database. All right, so that's how we control the size of our databases from inside of SharePoint, which is going to help help optimize SharePoint, and it's going to help optimize the recovery process in the event we have any issues with that. So one of the things we want to do is we want to look at some of the options that we can adjust, inside of SQL Server to make SQL Server run better, which ultimately is going to make SharePoint run better. For instance, by default, everything that we create, the MDF, the LDF, all the operating system files for SharePoint or SQL Server, they're all stored on the C drive. All right, so my LDF, my MDF, my NDF, all those are on the C drive. That's already a bad no-no, all right? We first want to get our LDF and our MDF on separate physical drives because LDF, remember, that has all our transactions. So that's our baby. We want to make sure we keep that protected. So we're going to keep that in a separate drive than our MDF. So if we lose my MDF, my drive have all my changes in my LDF, as long as I'm not in simple recovery model, because otherwise it's doo-doo, it's empty. So there's nothing we can do there. Minimum maximum settings. By default, SharePoint or SQL Server, each instance is an absolutely selfish hog when it comes to memory. So we need to adjust that. I'll show you that when we go into the demo. There's a thing called max degree of parallelism. If you just look up max degree of parallelism, it's going to say to set it up to set the number to the number of cores that you have in at your operating system level. That is not applicable to SharePoint. So if you add SharePoint into that search, it should say never, ever, 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 ever change it to anything but 1. All right, so make sure you always keep maxed up at 1. In fact, if you installed SharePoint 2013, it checks to make sure it's maxed up as 1, and it will change that. It will say, I can't install this until you change that. I'll try to show you that if we have time in there. Don't enable auto-create and auto-update of statistics, because that just messes around with the indexes. Don't mess with the indexes. If you're familiar with SQL Server, occasionally in normal content databases or not outside the SharePoint world, you rebuild indexes. Do not do that in the SharePoint world. It's all built in and taken care of for you. Here's the DBA create alias for you, so if you have to change instances. There is a little bit of a caveat with that if you're using the fast search SKU back in 2010. That SQL alias wasn't applicable to that. So if you are using SharePoint 2010 and you do have a SQL Server alias, that flip of a switch that I told you about from Server 1 to Server 4 is not going to be so straightforward if you're running the fast search SKU from 2010. Something unique about SharePoint is that it uses a very unique collation. So if I did a spousal installation for SQL, because that can be done, just okay, it's going to use the default collation, and now when I run SharePoint, SharePoint's not going to be able to talk to that. And I'm going to show you that in the demo. So what we need to do is during the installation of SQL Server, hosting SharePoint, we're going to set that collation. And again, I'm going to go in and show you that. Or during the creation of a content database, we're going to set that collation. So I'll show you some of the errors with that. So that's at the instance level. At the database level, that model database I was telling you about, where there's some things that we need to go in and fix. So we're going to look at those because the initial size is not good for us, nor is it for SQL Server, and the auto growth is not good. And the same with the TempDB, where the same settings I'm going to do for model database, we would do for the TempDB database as well. The TempDB database, being it's just garbage where we just slice and dice content, that's one database it's okay to be in simple recovery model because I'm not ever going to back up the TempDB database. There's nothing in there I need. It's just a location to temporary storage, store data. All right, let's go in and take a look at this. My mouse was acting a little flaky in here, so I'm hoping it's calmed down here. All right, so I'm in this big screen of my interface here. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the SQL side. And so again, you're having lunch. The first lunch with your SQL DBA is to get your own instance of SQL for SharePoint. Now, other lunches are going to be, by the way, I read this bald guy out in London told me I should be doing this at the instance level. Are we doing that? So this is the instance of SQL Server just for SharePoint. So what we would ask them to do is right-click on it and go to Properties. And let's look first at memory. So what this instance of SQL Server is going to do, if it needs to, it's going to take 2,147,483,000 megabytes of RAM. If it needs to. How many people have 2,147,000,000 mega? Nobody. Okay, good. If you do, I want to go to work for you. So if we have an instance of SQL Server just for SharePoint, and we have a line of business application or instance of SQL Server, the first one is going to win. So I have a 32 gigabyte machine, and I go in and I start running some reports, and I'm not in the SharePoint world. I'm running in the line of business apps. I'm in the finance department. And the SQL Server instance starts creeping up and taking that RAM. Now we've got 30 gigs of RAM consumed by that instance of SQL Server that's not SharePoint. Now our SharePoint crew comes in. They try to do work. It's going to stink because there's no RAM left. Because each instance of SQL Server, by default, has that 2 billion some odd set. And as long as nothing is... It's supposed to throttle back against the operating system, so it won't steal from that. But if the instance 1 of SQL Server takes all that RAM, instance 2, which is a SharePoint, is not going to have anything to work with. So for each instance of SQL Server, we need to drop that down to something reasonable. So let's say we have 32 gigs of RAM. I always allocate 4 to the operating system. So that leaves me 28 left. So what I can do for this instance of SQL Server is drop this and say, I want you to be 4096, which means you only get... Take the rest of this out here. So I guess for each instance, for this instance, you get 4 gigs of RAM, and then I could give the SharePoint server or instance the other 20 gigs of RAM. So remember, 32 for the operating system, we're giving 4 here. This will never go above 4 gigs of RAM for this instance of SQL Server. That leaves me 20 other gigs I can put to the other instance of SQL Server. So cap those instances so there's not one that's going to come in and beat out the rest of them for that RAM. The other thing you can do is actually set a minimum. So I could say, okay, let's set this to be 3072. And if I'm doing this, this will say once you've consumed 3 gigs, never fall below that. So it doesn't mean as soon as I spin up this instance, here's 3 gigs of RAM, it's all yours. It say once you've climbed up to 3 gigs, I'll never drop you below 3 gigs until we restart that instance of SQL Server. So it keeps it in a little sweet spot as far as you always have at least 3, so it doesn't have to go out, all right, dude, we can bring me in some more RAM. It's already allocated 3 towards it, but it'll never go above 4. Yes, sir?
Have you got any guidance regarding log pages in memory?
About the loading pages in memory?
Log pages in memory.
Oh, lock pages?
Yeah.
No, I don't, no. I would, like I said, the more SQL Server is one of those applications where the more RAM you can throw at it. Because remember I mentioned that buffer cache where it loads content in buffer cache. If you can allocate more RAM to the instance of SQL Server, it increases based on the amount of RAM on that buffer cache, and you'll get more information in that buffer cache. But that's about the best I got on that for you. So that's one thing we can do here. This image doesn't even have that, so I'm going to cancel on this. The other thing we need to do at the instance level is go down to Properties and then go down to Database Settings. And you're going to see by default, starting with SQL 2008, I believe, we've got data files. Look, they're going to the C drive. The log files, our LDF, is going to the C drive. We're even putting our backups on the C drive. Now, I think that's a good idea, don't you? Put everything on the C drive so you don't have to think about where everything's stored. Everything's on the C drive. You don't have to worry about, oh, was that in the C drive? Was that in the D? Just put it all there. To heck with it. No, it's not good. But so what did I say about the data file and the log file? Where should those be? Separate physical drives. Now, this virtual image doesn't have that. So we're going to pretend that C, we're going to pretend that's a D. And we're going to put this into our SQL data. So we'll pretend that's a C over there. If you can't pretend with your eyes open, you can close them, it's okay. And we're going to put this one SQL logs, and that's going to be our L drive. That will bug me if I don't fix that, just so you know. And then we're going to have the backups, and we're going to put this out. This could be out to a network share, but I have an SQL backups in here as well. And then we'll go ahead and do an OK on that. And now, whenever I create a new database, the key thing is new here. The LDF file will be put on the SQL logs. The MDF file will be on SQL data. And by default, when I kick off a backup, which I'll be doing a session on tomorrow on data recovery, the SQL, the backups will go to that SQL backups. Now again, because of the image, it's all on the C drive, but that should be like a D, an L, and maybe a file share somewhere. So make sure we set the database settings. Now, in order for those to take place, we have to restart, but we're not going to do that because of lack of time. So at the instance level, those are 2 things I want you to do. First is memory, and second is database, is the location. Now let's talk about the system databases here. Remember I talked the model database and the TempDB database. The TempDB database is that database that's used for slicing and dicing content. All right, but the model database is the one that's probably going to cause us the most issues. I'm going to right-click and go to Properties on that. And I'm going to go to Files. And you're going to see by default that the initial file size is 4 megabytes, and that for the MDF file, and 1 megabyte for the LDF file. And then, which means, remember, this is my Polaroid picture. So whenever I create a new database, it's going to take a Polaroid picture of this database right here. It's going to add in the SharePoint tables, and now that's going to be my starting database for that new web app. We'll say we spun up. The other thing it has an option on is auto growth, which means if I'm trying to upload a 10 megabyte file right now, well, I only have room. There's only 4. The initial size is only 4. I don't have enough room for that 10 megabyte file, so it's going to auto grow to allow. So instead of preventing me from uploading, it's going to auto grow and allow me to add that file. It's not a good way to do that, by the way. And it's the same for the LDF file. And you're going to see on the path on the right-hand side, we just fixed that at the level of at the instance level. We just didn't restart SQL Server. So what we need to do is we need to fix the model database so it doesn't have such a small database. So let me just do this here. I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to close this guy out here. So if I right-click and do a new database right now, and wait. You're going to see there's that 4 and there's that 1. As soon as I give it a name, these will be plugged in here. And there's the destination. So out of the box, SQL Server is not optimized in any way, shape, or manner. So we're going to make some changes here. We're going to go to Model Database. We're going to go to Properties. And after, again, a couple thousand meetings, we've decided that most of our databases are going to be, we'll say, we're going to make this one 500 megabytes just to keep it small so it doesn't take too long to build it. And normally your transaction log is anywhere between 10 and 25% the size of your MDF file. I always do the 25. So this could be 125 megabytes. So we're doing this just at the model. Now let's go to the autogrowth. The autogrowth says if you're trying to upload a file and you're out of, and there's not enough room, it's going to say, okay, instead of declining that file, we're going to grow. But what is this going to do? So let's say I go out there and I check and I see there's 4 megabytes of free space. I'm trying to upload a 10 megabyte file. It's going to stop. It's going to upload the first 4. It's like, okay, now we're short 6. What are we going to do? Well, by default, we have 1 megabyte autogrowth turned on. So it's going to say, okay, I can auto grow. I don't need to stop this. I'm going to auto grow by 1 megabyte. Now I have room for a 5th megabyte. It adds that. Then it needs to stop again and add the 6th. Then it stops again and add a 7th. So the other thing we want to do, it'll do that all the way till the 10. So the next thing the other thing we want to do is we want to change the auto growth setting. So we can set this baby to, we'll say in megabytes, if it's 500, I'm going to set this to about 250, and then we'll go ahead and do it okay. And we want to do the same thing with the transaction log. By default, this is in percent. I like using megabytes because I know exactly how long it's going to take. It's not going to be dependent on the size of it because it's a percentage. So I'm going to change this so this grows in 75 megabytes. Because like I said, if it's in a percentage, if it's 5 gigs, it might take 3 nanoseconds. If it's 500 gigs, it might take 3 minutes. So we've changed the initial size, the auto growth, and again, these settings, you don't change them here. That's set at the instance level. So we're going to go ahead and do an OK on this. And that's going to, all we've done is change the model database. Now this has nothing to do with all the databases that are already out there. This is only for new databases when we create new databases. So if I already have 10, 12 databases out there, which you'll see I do, these all need to be adjusted accordingly. This is going to be just for new databases. Still churning. Any questions about what we've talked about so far while we're waiting for this to grow a little bit?
Yes. Will all those settings apply when you create stuff within SharePoint? Because I think, I remember seeing a video that said one of them, the auto growth, doesn't.
Yeah, exactly right. So what I'm about to demonstrate for you is that this is going to look pretty in here, but if you actually, there's 2 things we need to worry about. So if you're building it from inside of SharePoint, the auto growth doesn't take, the new auto growth setting we just set doesn't work. So now every time you create a new database inside of SharePoint, you need to talk to your DBA, hence why you keep taking them out to lunch, getting them drunk, because they'll help you with that. So let me just show you that, and I'll get right to your question right here. So what he's saying is, if I go right now, if I right click, as a DBA, I just changed the model database. I'm going to right click and do new database. I'm not quite sure why it's so slow today. So I'm going to right click. So DBA just made those changes. They're going to come in, they're going to do a right click, new database, and they don't even have to create the database. They're going to see the settings like, oh, everything's fixed. I got everything fixed. But like he was just talking about, we've got, dude, come on here. But what we were talking about is the fact that the auto growth doesn't come over. So here we are inside of SQL. I do a new database. Maybe Access is better. Just kidding. Actually, this one's a local image. I tried not to do cloud stuff, especially at presentations like this. But this isn't really doing me any favors on that argument. When that pops up, I'm going to click on Files if it's not there by default. You can see all the databases I already have over here. My Managed Metadata Service, my User Profile Service, my Search Service. Those are already built out for me because I've already installed some of that, and this is a dedicated instance of SQL for my SharePoint. I don't know what's going on here. This is brutal. What was your question, sir?
It's really about, so if you've got full recovery mode, right? What I've seen in one particular case is a lot of content databases, and the search database, the log is just going out of control. The DBA isn't handling it. Now, what I've been doing is going on regularly saying, here's how you shrink it, let's shrink that down. What can they do? They're back in the transaction log is shipped every 15 minutes, transaction log shipping. What can they do to keep that log size down? What are they doing wrong?
We're going to address that in about, yeah, I'm actually going to cover, without a doubt, cover that piece. So here we are with our new initial size. Here's our auto growth. Those settings are in there now. So the DBA thinks, you know, they're happy as a peacock. They're all good. But if you go into the SharePoint world, when you go over here, and you go into application management, which might take a day. So if we come in here and create a content database from inside of SharePoint, the auto growth setting that we just fixed or adjusted inside of SQL Server does not get picked up. It's an undocumented feature. No, it's something, what happens, they actually send a script over from SharePoint, and in that script, and it's been out there for every version I've been working with. I'm not sure what this thing is doing. So it's a known deal that they have. So whenever we create a database from inside of SharePoint, so it's a script that's sent over. The good news about that script that's being sent over is that that collation I was telling you about, which hopefully I'll be able to demo for you sometime this year, it actually sets that for me. So I go in here to manage content databases. This is probably going to take too much time, so I'm going to ask you to just trust me on this one. So if I create a content database in here, it's going to create it inside of SharePoint. It's in SQL Server. When I go in and hit properties, like I just showed you on the new database from inside of SQL Server, that auto growth is going to be back to the 1 and 10 megabytes or 10%. So be careful about that. How late do I go here? Quarter past? Is that right? I think I started at quarter past, and we're an hour. Okay, so that's how I would come in and out of content database here, and I would it would come out in the SQL side, not without the new auto growth settings there. All right, let's jump out of that. Let's come back over here. The model database, we've got everything here I wanted to show you. I only have about 10 minutes. I want to make sure we go through that data recovery deal. All right, I'm done with this. This is way too slow. Let's just, let me have my machine back, dudes, and I'll be happy here. Yeah, I'm guessing it's busy. Thank you. Thanks for the brilliant tip there. All right, let's jump back into here. Okay, so let's do this. Let's continue on with this baby. How do we avoid the ginormous transaction logs? Follow up to your question there and implement a data recovery strategy with SharePoint. So one of the challenges that we run into is the fact that we have a 384 megabyte MDF file, and I've seen a 12 gigabyte LDF file. There's that much of a discrepancy. We're not talking just double. We're talking like 50 times as much. So one of the challenges is we have to do a backup of the transaction log. We have to either go into SQL Management Studio and back up the transaction log itself, or we have to use a backup log statement. And I think what causes problems is the definition of Microsoft's definition of a full backup. A full backup is defined roughly like it will back up the data file and the LDF file, and the transaction log file. Well, it's not fully true, because what happens here, so this MDF file, so this is Sunday night, and our process, we're going to walk through a process. So we're going to do two things here in this demo. We're going to walk through on how we can create a good backup process and without losing any data, and then we're also going to look at how to avoid those ginormous transaction logs. So what our strategy is, after having our 5th shot of tequila with our DBA, is we're going to do a full backup on Sunday night. And if we read the definition of the full backup, it says it's going to back up the MDF file, the data file, and it says it's going to back up the LDF file. Well, that's not fully true. If that backup of the MDF file ticks off at 5 p.m., there's a little tick mark that's put in the LDF file saying backup started. And let's say that ends at 10 p.m. There's another tick mark put at the top of the LDF file, end of backup. And so what it does is all the content that was written from here out to my backup directory, it goes to the LDF file now, and between 5 p.m. and 10 p.m. it grabs all those transactions and it writes it to that file. So that's why they're saying that the LDF file is backed up. It's not really backed up. The transactions that take place during the backup are then backed up. But the transaction log is not backed up, which means it's never purged. That's where we get gigabytes of LDF files, okay? So that's part of the problem. It's probably not as clear as to what a full backup does. Is that a beer? Oh, Spence, sorry. I warned everybody earlier, don't do that, because I just assume it's a beer. So, all right. So back onto the databases. So we've got our MDF. So what we're going to do to fix this now, we're going to do a full backup on Sunday night. It's going to back up the MDF file and all the transactions between the LDF file. The LDF file is still going to be huge right, at this point. Monday night, we're going to do a differential backup, which means any change that come in Monday night. Let's say the full backup on Sunday night was 60 gigs. Monday night, we had 5 gigs of backups, of changes. So Monday, we're just going to back up the 5 gigs of changes. Tuesday, we're going to do another differential, which is going to include all the changes from Monday and all the changes from Tuesday. So now we're up to, say, 8 gigs. Wednesday night, we're going to have all the changes from Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Now we're up to, say, 13 gigabytes. So now, oops, in the wrong button. There's Tuesday and there's Wednesday. So differential / cumulative are those types of backups that we're getting. So now, why am I doing differential / cumulative? Because a backup strategy, there's one goal in mind when you create a backup strategy. Minimize the recovery strategy. Minimize the downtime or how amount of time it takes to recover that content, to get the databases back up and running. So with a full backup on Sunday, differentials on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, what we're going to do is now we're going to have a problem on Thursday. So on 4 o'clock on Thursday, we're going to lose our MDF file, which is on that D drive I told you, and that's why we want a separate LDF file, or our LDF files on the L drive. So we lose our MDF file. Our LDF file is still fine because that's on a separate physical drive. If I'm in simple recovery model, what can I do with that LDF file right there? Jack. Nothing, because it's empty. I'm purging it out every 60 seconds. Hence why we don't want to put anything in production in simple recovery model. So what do? Let's say with the data recovery process first. So what we're going to do is like, okay, because all the transactions are still in the LDF file, the first statement I'm going to issue is I'm going to back up the log, and I'm going to use what's called the switch call with no recovery. It's going to take a snapshot of everything that's in this LDF file, including all the transactions that took place on Thursday up until 4 p.m. Okay? If this was in simple recovery model, this dude's empty, so the best I can do is recover from Wednesday night, whenever I did that backup Wednesday night. So the good news is we've got all our stuff in here. So the first command we're going to issue is a backup of that log and get a picture of everything in that log file. Then we're going to go back and we're going to do the recovery process. We're going to restore a backup from Sunday night. That is everything. We're going to add all the changes that were taken Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. We just need to restore Wednesday's differential because they're all in there, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Now, because we backed this up first, our fourth step is going to be to restore these changes that took place on Thursday. So with the unlikely, we might lose one transaction that didn't quite make it to the MDF file. So instead of losing it all day, we actually only lose potentially a transaction or 0 transactions. Okay? So that's why I don't want you in simple recovery model. And that's plan A of this slide is, okay, this is why, Brian, you've convinced me I don't want to use simple recovery model. But what you haven't done is convince me, how do I get rid of my ginormous transaction logs? Because what did I say the problem was? How do we get ginormous transaction logs? What's the problem? We don't back up the log file. When up here is the best time for me to back up do a backup log statement in this whole process right here. Sunday. I'm least concerned. So right here, I've got my MDF file in production. I just made a full backup of it over here. And now I don't really care as much about what's in there at the LDF file. So, and this can be done right in SQL Server. You can actually, step 1, do a full backup of the MDF file. Step 2, on success of step 1, which means don't do step 2 unless the step 1 is successful, then we can actually go out there and issue this command right here. Back up the log database bank, dump it to a temporary directory with a init, which means every week that's going to run. So that log file will be backed up, and it will hang out there until next week. And you don't even have to do that. In fact, the SharePoint 2010 and the 2013 book, the editors challenged me because I had another step, is to delete this file afterwards. I don't even need to keep that. If you want to keep it for a week, go for it. Your third step of that job with the DBA could be to go out and delete this file right here that we just put up there in red. We could just toast that. We don't need it anymore. But if you want to keep it out there for the week, keep it out there for the week. And next week, that with a init says just right over there what was there from last week. Yes, sir.
I think the recommendation to keep it is because you don't actually need the differentials so you can restore the full from the Sunday and then every single log backup right to that point of failure. So that's the reason they recommend to keep the logs.
Yeah, one of the things you can do is one of the things you can do with a transaction log is to a point in time. So let's say we were doing a bunch of work. Spence and I went out and had lunch. We had a couple cocktails. We came back, did some work, and they saw us coming in the door at 2 because we only took a 4-hour lunch. It was a short one. And we started doing some work. And from 2 to 4 was just, whatever we entered was just, gibberish. So what they could do is they could back up that transaction log and then restore it up until 2 o'clock when we walked into the door. So it's called a point-in-time recovery. We can do that with the transaction log. And that's why I stopped saying to delete it, is to have it hang out for a week. And then if you need it, you've got it out there for a point-in-time recovery. All right, questions on that? Make sense? So now we know how to put a decent recovery process in place, and we know how to avoid ginormous transaction logs. Okay, best practices. Curtains, you like that? Okay, put that in special for you guys. All right, dedicated SQL Server instance. It needs its own collation, memory settings, model database settings, all those things, those items that we talked about here. No spousal installations of SQL or SharePoint, all right? Database size should not exceed 200 gigabytes. I don't care what you read online for MaxTop. If it's with SharePoint, it's set to 1. Create a SQL alias. Have your DBA, again, take those guys out, get them drunk once a month, or lunch once a month. Modify the model database like we did in the demo. What I've seen people do is try to keep the databases inside, so they'll actually turn on auto growth and set it, and then they'll actually auto shrink it at night. So I'm like, well, so it grows all day, which is cost, and then it shrinks it at night, so tomorrow it gets to grow again. Turn off auto shrink. There may be situations where you add 40 gigs of content that you need to shrink it back down. You can use what's called a DBCC shrink file to do that, but do that on a case-by-case instance, not an auto shrink setup. Use the database autogrowth sparingly because that'll reduce fragmentation, improve data entry performance. To me, autogrowth is like an insurance policy. Set that initial size to be large enough so it doesn't need to autogrow, but have the autogrowth there just in case it hits that max so people aren't prevented from doing any work. Spread data files and transaction logs across RAID 5 or 10. You saw why it's important to keep the LDF and the MDF files separated. Create multiple temp DB files on multiple drives. That's those MDF files which will come into play. So you can only have one temp DB database, but you can have multiple MDF files associated with that across multiple drives. If you're new to SharePoint, if you volunteered for SharePoint and got stuck with SQL Server as well, not realizing how tightly integrated they were, there's a wizard in there called the Database Maintenance Plan Wizard. Walk through that. That'll get you backups, that'll get you reports, that'll get you what's called DBC Check DB. You can check the database integrity, all sorts of options there. If you're new, you need to get something in place, use that Database Maintenance Plan Wizard. Periodically defragment your drives where your database files are. Don't screw with the indexes inside of SQL Server databases for SharePoint. They're taken care of for internally. Yes, sir?
Yeah, that's the big one for me. Why? I just don't understand why you wouldn't do that.
The way the SQL Server tables are built, those two teams work well with each other, SharePoint teams. They take care of all that internally. That's the best answer I've got for you is don't mess with those indexes. It will actually, I've actually read numerous times, it will actually make performance worse for you.
Yeah, I've read that, but I don't understand.
Yeah, something with the internals, sir. I apologize, I'm not quite sure what it is. Yes, sir.
It's about the defect question. A lot of people out there using what sounds like pure SSD drives, and I'm asking not all else to do is waste your drives.
For if you defrag. Sorry.
Defragging on the SSD, my understanding is that gains you nothing, but you're wearing effectively out the drives.
Yeah, this is generally speaking. If you've got high performance drives, your SSD, I would say.
Coming across it all the time now.
Okay, perfect. All right, excellent. Thank you very much. Regular backups of database and transaction logs, monitor SQL Server and performance, run the DBCC check DB. Again, that's your DBA's task, not your task. And then again, go say no to the simple recovery model because we saw what that can cause for issues for you if you put that into simple recovery model. Any other questions? Thank you very much.